December 26, 1862, 38 men were hung in Mankato, Minnesota, in what is known as the largest mass execution by hanging in U.S. history. 2 years later, 2 other men were found guilty and hung as well. So that's where you get the 38 plus 2. But what led to the conflict known as the US-Dakota War? And why were these 38 plus 2 men executed in the first place? That will be the topic of today's video. The US-Dakota War has many causes, but these are the 3 main ones. Land cession treaties that began at the beginning of the 19th century in 1805 and extended up to 1858, which is the year Minnesota became a state. Also, food shortages contributed to the outbreak of war, and mainly this is because treaty payments in the summer of 1862 were late, and this coupled with a bad harvest to create starvation in a very desperate situation for the Dakota, which I'll explain later. And since the treaty in 1805, tensions between white settlers, the Dakota people, and the government had been brewing, and in 1862, specifically in August of 1862, these tensions came to a head. Some issues included the fact that traders were supposed to give the Dakota their annuity payments, but of course, traders wanted the money for themselves. So rightly, the Dakota were suspicious of traders in general. And then also, after the 1805 treaty, settlers encroached on Dakota land soon after, thus beginning the conflict between the Dakota and settlers. So the treaties of 1805 and 1837 were as follow. In 1805, the first major land cession treaty between the Dakota and the U.S. government was finalized. It ceded a piece of land at the mouth of the St. Croix River, which, if you did not know, is the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin, at least for part of the state border until the Mississippi River connects with it. Then it becomes the Mississippi. So that piece of land was ceded, as well as a 9-mile stretch at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. And this is important because that piece of land includes the birthplace of the Dakota. They believe that the site at which is known as Pedote in their language contains the birthplace of the Dakota. And that ended up being where Fort Snelling would be built. So Fort Snelling is actually built on the birthplace of the Dakota at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. And then in 1837, another piece of land, except this one much bigger, was taken from the Dakota. And that included all of the land east of the Mississippi River. And I use the word taken because in a lot of these treaties, the Dakota were tricked into giving up their land because of the way missionaries transcribed the treaties into Dakota, or what they knew of Dakota at the time, as Dakota was not a written language. So they kind of the government used that to their advantage when executing these treaties. So I will be using the word taken a lot to refer to these treaties. In 1851 and 1858, the Dakota gave up even more land, millions of acres actually. And these treaties were signed with different bands of Dakota. There are 7 groups of Dakota. They're called part of the 7 Council Fires, actually. That's what they term the groups. And 4 of these groups currently live on the reservation. That came out of the 1858 treaty, basically. So each of these treaties was with different bands of Dakota. The first one ceded 35 million acres of land in exchange for $3.75 million. which back then was a lot of money. So this is where the annuity payments start to pop up. And then the Dakota were confined to a 10-mile wide stretch of the Minnesota River. And it's basically a 10-mile wide by 100-mile long stretch of the Minnesota River from basically New Ulm northwestward up to the South Dakota border, basically. And in 1858, another 955,000 acres were taken by the government in a separate treaty. So this process of moving Native Americans onto reservations in Minnesota basically began with the Treaty of 1837 when the government took the Dakota land east of the Mississippi away from them. Now that is a historical point that can be argued. As mentioned, there were tensions between the three different groups. The government, US government, the Dakota, and the white settlers. This picked up particularly after the 1805 treaty. That was mainly for military purposes, but it also opened up the area for settlement by white settlers as well. And soon enough, white settlers began encroaching on Dakota land. Traders would build stores for the Dakota people to buy things eventually. And this contributed to hopefully making a better relationship, but that was not necessarily the case, a better relationship between the government and the Dakota people, but that was not necessarily the case, as the government had a plan to assimilate the Dakota people as they did with most, if not all, Native American tribes. Some Dakota people became farmers, and then there were also missionaries trying to convert Native Americans to Christianity. So those tensions combined with food shortages, as previously mentioned, the payment for the summer of 1862 was delayed. And because the Civil War was going on at this time, this is August 1862 we're talking about right now, the Civil War had been going for over a year at this point. There was talk that the payment might not even come, and if it came, the payment would be paper money rather than gold. Combine this talk with a bad harvest and the fact that food was scarce because of that bad harvest, and a desperate situation arose, particularly on August 17th, 1862. 4 Dakota men were out on a hunting expedition. They came across a homestead, and they were searching for food when they were confronted by, or they actually, I should say, got into a shootout with a white man, and it ended up leading to 5 white settlers being killed. That night, these men went back to their tribe, and the elders debated whether or not to go to war with the US government and white people who were encroaching on their settlement, as it was inevitable that they'd probably get taken over at some point. That was the argument that some people chose to go to war. Now, it is important to note that not all Dakota wanted to go to war. It was actually mainly only a couple of the 7 bands that fought in the war. And there are statistics that, according to the Minnesota Historical Society, say of the 6,000 Dakota living on the reservation lands at this time in 1862, only about 1,000 actually fought. And the decision, though reluctantly, especially in the eyes of Little Crow, who was one of the main chiefs at the time, was to go to war. And this first major event was actually a looting and burning of the warehouse where food was stored at the Upper Sioux Agency, as it's called now. Basically, if you did not know this, there are 2 main Dakota reservations in Minnesota. One is known as Upper Sioux, that's by Redwood Falls, Minnesota, and take that back, that's Lower Sioux. Lower Sioux is by Redwood Falls. Upper Sioux is by Granite Falls. So those are the two main Dakota reservations, at least in southwest Minnesota. This is where we're talking about because that's where the majority of the war took place. Acton Township is by Hutchinson, Minnesota, which is about an hour west of Minneapolis. So that's about as close to the metro as the war would get. It was mainly concentrated in southwest Minnesota. And the warehouse keeper was said to have told the Dakota to eat grass, and that could have also inflamed the tensions there. So the second question that we're examining today is why death, and why were these 38 plus 2 Dakota men hung? So here at OneStop History, we do not necessarily delve into the military history as much as it is our belief that the cause and effects of events are more important than the military history of it. If you'd like to see military history videos in the future, feel free to comment and let us know if that's the case. But anyway, in terms of who died in the conflict, it was mainly white settlers, 600 of them, 75 to 100 Dakota soldiers, and 75 U.S. soldiers died, as well as troops that were being prepared to ship out for the Civil War were actually diverted to help settle this rebellion, as it was termed by the government at this time. It's also known as the Great Sioux Uprising. That's another name for this conflict. So anyway, after the war wrapped up, trials were completed very quickly for these men. Some only lasted 5 minutes. They were basically tried by military officers, so not by the normal criminal justice system in the U.S. at the time. Originally, 303 men were sentenced to death. However, Abraham Lincoln reduced that number to 39. There were also 16 that were handed down prison sentences, and Lincoln reduced this number to basically the men that participated in the massacres of white settlers and basically the fighting of the war in general. One man got a reprieve at the last minute and was not executed, so that brings the total to 38. And then, as previously mentioned, 2 more men were executed in 1865. So in conclusion, treaties, food shortages, and tensions between the Dakota settlers and the U.S. government led to the US-Dakota War and the ensuing mass execution on December 26, 1862, which is the largest mass execution by hanging in United States history. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this in the future. It massively helps me out. And let me know what types of videos you want to see in the future in the comments.